hour, nor would you want me to do that. But just a little bit of background for those of you who don't know me. Obviously, I'm a proud member of Kirkland class of 75. I'm located in Boston, in Roslindale, for those of you who know Boston. I have a coaching and consulting company. We do executive coaching, leadership development, kinds of organizational change work. We do work with team, we do team coaching. So it's a company called Aduro Consulting, and we specialize in leadership and change for purpose-driven companies. And before that, I had about 30 years inside organizations. I worked in city government. I have a master's in public administration. So my formative team years were in the halls of City Hall. And if you can do well in City Hall and teams, it was like probably I learned more there than any place else in my life. And then I did 14 years in corporate human resources that took me the last 4 years to the Netherlands, where I was worked for a corporation for ING Bank, and I was their global head of leadership and change. So I've had the opportunity to work with global teams as well, and a lot of different nationalities. So all of that all together, I've had about, I was adding it up this morning, over 30 years of working with teams. So what I want to do is I'm going to just say a few things just to kind of get us started. And then I'm much more interested in what your questions are. I don't pretend teams are endlessly complicated and fascinating, and you may have much better answers to questions than come up, or experiences. But just a couple things just to preface this. One is, we called this virtual teaming in the age of COVID, because it's kind of, we think of it as kind of like the great equalizer, because absolutely everybody over these last 3 months has had to learn how to work virtually, whether they were familiar with it or not. And I would also add that we were not aware at the time we scheduled this about what the week that we would be in right now. And it's been a painful week or more since the death of George Floyd and the protests, and many of you may have been involved in it or impacted by it somehow, but there's a lot of pain in our organizations right now. So a lot of my clients are experiencing it, a lot of my friends, I am experiencing it. So it's more important than ever right now, I think, this topic, because I think we usually forget that organizations and teams are human systems. And that's one of the biggest flaws in the way in which we operate. So if there's ever time to be human, I would say this is it. So let's just start with, I just want to talk a little bit about, before we get to virtual teaming and kind of the specific situations, is about what do we mean by teams? And I'm curious how, since it's a small group, I can kind of ask you, if you don't mind, you're welcome. You can put your mute on if you want, but it's a small group. If you want to just leave it off and we can just talk too, which is how would you define a team? What is a team to you guys? What constitutes a team? Hi, Nancy. I'll welcome people as they come in. Any thoughts about that?
I'll jump in.
Sure.
This is Rob Conklin.
Yeah.
A team is a group of people who need to cooperate and collaborate for a particular mission.
Yeah, that's great. That's actually pretty accurate. Any other thoughts about how else what are the criteria for a team?
I always like to think of it as a group that's got a common purpose, whether
yes.
it's, something that's finite and has because you can have a task force or something that's
right,
or something that's kind of long-term, that you're all employees of the same institution. So.
Yeah, absolutely. All completely accurate. My first training doing team, I was like a budding trainer. I had its job at Aetna Insurance, and I'd never worked in insurance. I thought it was a hoot that I was even in the corporate world. And they threw me in to do team coaching, but I had this incredible experience. The program or the method they taught us had been developed by a South African, who had kind of learned what he was teaching us from the townships in South Africa. It was really kind of a remarkable way to get introduced to teams. And they define teams, and I've always used this as, and it includes everything you're saying, is they have a definable membership. So you know who they are. If it's amorphous, that's not really the team. You got to find out if there is a definable membership. There's a shared purpose, which is what you're all saying. There's a reason that we are here. There's some interdependence. We're not just operating as solo operators. We actually have to rely on each other, and there's interaction. But the one I particularly love is there's also a sense of belonging. And if there is not a sense of belonging, you actually have to question, it's either not a team or it's not fully functioning as a team. So those are oftentimes when we work with teams, we actually will just put those 5 criteria up. And sorry, did I say one, 2, 3, whatever, and actually ask the team. The very first exercise is have a conversation. To what extent does this apply to your team? They can go an entire day. It brings up everything for conversation. So do we have interaction? No, you do, we don't. Who's interacting with each other? Do we have a sense of belonging? It tends to bring up all the kind of issues that need to be talked about. So I also think the same early training in teams that I learned is that teams think of teams as they operate on 2 levels. Now this is just a model. They probably operate on more, but I have found this really, really helpful. They operate first of all on a level of what you might want to call process, which is how we work together. And they have norms of behavior, they have patterns of behavior. There's what you would call themes or a tone. There's a mood that goes with the theme. And then they also operate on what you call the content side, which is the problems that they have to solve, the decisions that they have to make. And teams have to do both effectively. They can love each other while they're going over the cliff, or they can be so great at process, but there's so much internal conflict. They actually have to be able to do both well. And so because of that, like I said earlier, they're human systems. They're very complex. I always tell people when I'm working with teams that team is not the sum of the individuals. You can have a group of very smart people and you can have a really stupid team. I'm sure you have examples, right? And conversely, you can have a team that's smarter than any one individual in there. If you can get if there's like secret sauce, I mean, let me just do this for a minute, kind of we do the hand raise. Have you all had good team experiences that you can point to? Right? So you kind of know it when you see it, right? We've all had it. It's like it clicks. It's just amazing. So the part of it, what I want to work with you on today is really what is it? What is that secret sauce? What makes it click? And particularly now what we're doing. So the thing about it, part of it is that collectively, just as individuals, we have to grow and become self-aware. Teams have to collectively become self-aware. Until they can step back and see themselves in terms of how they're interacting with each other, they can operate in the dark and they can fall into some really kind of dangerous traps. So you have to operate as teams as if they can learn. And I always operate as if they have the capacity to become self-correcting and high-performing. So this is where, when I'm going to stop in a minute, and I just want to hear what's interesting you about that. What do you want to talk about? What are some of our experience about that secret sauce and what makes this work? But I'll say a couple things about virtual teams and now. I mean, I've been working at home for 14 years. And so I'm used to it, but I wasn't doing Zoom. I will be perfectly honest. I'm not a huge fan of Zoom a lot. I'll tell you why later. I'll tell you why in a minute, okay? It's fine, but it's being tremendously overused right now. I think it's actually probably hurting teams. The thing is, the name of the game in teams and in organizations right now is always engagement. There's a whole science around it. Engagement is related to business performance. All of that is true. I always tell business leaders you can come at it from 2 ways. There's kind of the business. We need people engaged in order we can make money or achieve organizational success, or you can come at it from the humanistic. We need people engaged because, we're human beings and we have a drive towards fulfillment and satisfaction. So whichever way you want to go to, it really is about engagement. So it's pretty tricky when you no longer go into the office every day. I mean, even I work at home, but I traveled a lot. And Trish, I'd love to go get that cup of coffee with you, It's like, I do that all the time. But now suddenly, we can just see each other in these boxes. And it's been, and many teams, I've had some companies, they've worked in their little bubble in their office and they've never been outside, and suddenly they're thrown out and all the rules are changed. They can't read anything from all the body language they might want to read to, you know, I would talk and, you know, have a chat with Jeff every morning, you know, and now that isn't available. So it's a kind of, it just kind of resets the rules. There's also, I think this is really interesting, the historian in me, is the collapse in work and family boundaries. Any of you have kids, other families at home with you? I know, I don't, yes, right, exactly. So, you know, there's a whole body of work around the separation of work and home began somewhere around the Industrial Revolution, some say around First World War. And there's a huge body of work. A lot of feminist researchers have looked at this because the rules of the game were, you know, emotion and personal stuff stayed at home and rationality and business went to work. And there's been this unwritten rule that never the twain shall meet. And I think this is actually exciting because I mean, one of my colleagues, her son Zane is sitting on a lap all the time and I'm having conversations with Zane. My daughter is a vice principal at a school in Massachusetts. And early on, you know, she's doing Zoom calls with the superintendent. And she goes, wait a minute. She has to go break up the fight with her two kids who she thought were going to be playing chess really nicely, you know, and it's like, no, I got to break up the fight. So this is like, you know, we don't know the impact of this yet, but this is really different. The biggest thing I'm hearing is that we talk about them as human systems. I think we're using Zoom in our interactions. We're defaulting, when you talk about leadership development, it's always task and relationship. We're defaulting to the task. So it's very work oriented. Of course, people have been in various forms of crisis and in and out of crisis for 3 months. So that drives them towards, what are we gonna do? How are we gonna do it? Their amygdalas are going crazy. And what's falling by the wayside is relationship, but we don't really know how to create relationship. I mean, I love all you guys, but your box is in front of me, right? So that's going on. And then here's my diatribe on Zoom, and then I really will be quiet. The interesting thing is I've been coaching for maybe 15, 20 years. I was trained as a coach to work on the phone. So I've been coaching virtually for years. I now know there's actually a lot of research that's interesting showing that one-on-one phone is probably more effective than the visual. There's a kind of an intimacy that will occur over the phone that you don't get this way. You can, I've seen it happen. I'm not saying it won't happen, but the phone, and actually if you think about it, we're sensing, we have bodies that we have 5 senses, and we're overusing this visual sense to the detriment of the auditory, the kinesthetic, our other ways of knowing and learning. The other thing is, so many people have told me how exhausted they are at the end of the day. There's a really interesting New York Times article, maybe you guys saw it. It's called Why Zoom is Terrible. You want to go find this. And it explained to me the science behind why we're all so tired. And it says that Zoom is like the difference between making a fresh blueberry muffin and a processed blueberry muffin. Because Zoom is pixelated, our minds are wired to read facial expression, and they're working so hard to do that we're exhausting ourselves by the end of the day by overusing it. So I found that, it was like, wow, that is really helpful to know. So we're not, how many of you, well, how many people either you or you talk to people and they are Zoom, like I've talked to people, they're like, and my brother, he's like 7 in the morning, 7 o'clock at night is what he's doing. And they say, I don't understand why I'm so exhausted at the end of the day. Does that make sense, you guys? All right, so lots to talk about. Let's start with either reactions to what I'm saying, thoughts, questions, topics you want to throw out. Let's just kind of dive in.
I had a question around the work-life balance. And
Yeah.
so I'm single, I live by myself, just me and my dog. And I love, to your point, like seeing the children and getting to know kind of the behind the scenes of family and whatnot. But I also know the toll it takes that these people, my colleagues, my friends who are dealing with being homeschooling parents and trying to live a full life, and that I know how much more I'm working from home, that it's not 9 to 5 anymore.
Yes.
Recommendations, thoughts for how we as managers or as employees can be better at like saying like, time out, like we don't have to work 24 hours a day just because technology is there.
Right. Just out of curiosity, do you also manage people, Tricia, or are you?
I, excuse me, I don't right now, but I will once our furloughed employees come back.
Okay, good. So it's both for yourself personally and for people working. You know, it's really interesting. Again, I've been working at home for 14 years, and so it's kind of familiar to me. My sisters and I were all self-employed, and years ago, my sister said to me, the only difference between work weekdays and weekends is less guilt on weekends. That kind of describes, you know, because I can keep working, but it's kind of my own schedule. It is a tough one because I think it's probably both internal, external, right? So if you don't set boundaries, no one else is going to set them for you. It just won't happen. So I tend to use my calendar. Actually, even if I can't always keep to it, but I block out time. You know, I just like to start early, and then, you know, again, it's probably even harder when you're single or solo and you don't have a partner who's going to tell you, you got to stop at the end of the day. You said you live with your dad, but you could get into an agreement like, this is the commitment I have to myself. So it's partly that, it's partly, and I think as a manager, maybe it'll help you because you have to set a good example for people. So I know managers, you know who I think has written a lot about this is Arianna Huffington. You might want to look at some of her, but this is beforehand because she exhausted her so much, she fell and hit her head, and then she went forth and she's written a whole about kind of self-care, taking on meditative habits, things about it because you're virtual. People don't know if you right? Yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Martha, I was just going to say one other thing. So as a recovering management consultant, I've had a lot of thoughts about this and just really tactically have taken kind of a couple of things, you know, into account, particularly during this time. So one, leaving my cell phone outside of my bedroom at night. So it's not the first thing I look at in the morning. The second is really setting that example, not only for my, my direct reports, but just kind of company-wide in terms of delaying the send of emails. So even if it's in my best interest, you type something up and get it kind of out of my mind at 7:30 p.m., like I'm not going to hit send on it until I open my computer the next morning during business hours, just so that I'm not reinforcing that kind of always on culture and mentality, which, you know, seems to be, I think the first week we were all working, everyone was like, you know, emails flying around at all hours. And after kind of having a couple talks with folks, like we've sort of calmed that down a little bit. And you see sort of a barrage come in at 8:30, 9 o'clock in the morning, but you have your whole day to attack it, as opposed to learning about it at 7:30, 8, 9 p.m. at night and having to expend mental energy on it that evening. So, or
That's
whatever
great.
It's worth.
Yeah, they say that, you know, you have new habits take repetition, so you have to kind of deliberately make some declarations and instill new habits. I also think in terms of, and I'll mention something, it kind of brings up something else I want to mention, but particularly when you're managing other people, this is a little bit of a, you know, related, a little bit of a new topic, but being a lot more, you know, we used to separate work and family, but actually acknowledging and incorporating people's special circumstances. So knowing if someone got family members and actually talking with them, how can we incorporate that? What do you need? How can we incorporate it? They might have a parent who's ill. They might be living alone and need some support. So like my son, he lives in the Netherlands and he's been alone all this time. And he said early on, it was really great. It was one of his team members who would just call him every day, how are you doing? And that was helpful, I think, for his well-being, but it was also really helpful. I think you could probably use that as like almost have an accountability partner. Like, okay, you're going to stop now, right? You're not going to keep working. So there's ways, so part of it is also using the people around you. The thing I want to add that I think this kind of brings up is, because you're not alone on this, Tricia. It's like, these are common issues, is to have conversations either with your teams about this. And because like, remember I said the teams need to become kind of collectively self-aware. And there are a couple of practices you can put in place for that. I mean, what you're really trying to do is you want to create trust, connection, relationship, so you can start having conversations. One of the best ways to do that is to actually establish some kind of ground rules for the team, which requires a really kind of open, you got to set the stage. What's an open conversation we can have about this? One of the best ways to do it is to say, what are some of the ground rules now? So let me give you an example on ground rules, or we used to call them norms. Some people, there's all different kinds of names for them. But norms actually usually are put in place without thinking about them. The example I always like to use is around elevators. And I used to, when you come, remember elevators? We used to go to elevators. So you walk up to an elevator. What are some of the elevator norms? Just kind of shout them out. What do you know about elevator norms?
You move far apart from people.
Exactly.
Back.
Say it again.
Face the doors.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And you stand forward. You don't talk, right? It would be rude to talk. I mean, it would like just be so your mother never took you to elevator school, right? And they're very cultural. So like when I was in the Netherlands, people, when they left the elevator, they would say, good day in Dutch. And it was like startling. It's like, oh my God, they're talking to me in the elevator. That's like, seems really weird. So teams are the same way. They will start to pick up patterns of operating that they've never collectively decided on. So if you think about, so again, I'll even go back to the expectations around how long we work is a great example. But your example, Amy, is a great one also. It's like either, it's okay to send emails at midnight, or there's an expectation that if I send an email, you gotta get back in, an hour, or there's an expectation that, it's okay, somebody just kind of ghosts, right? And they're gone. So whatever it is, there's a lot of unconscious kind of unspoken. So one of the best things you can do with your team is to have a conversation about ground rules. And I'll give you some, and basically what you're trying to do is create, remember I talked about both process, how we work together, and the work itself. You want to create some kind of ground rules that are going to help the team work well together. So some of them are really around psychological safety. How do we operate in a way that makes sure that people feel they're not being shamed by each other, they're not being blamed, there's comfort, it's kind of a safe place to talk. So sometimes it's useful to talk about, how we do operate already, but then put in place, so what would be your ideal? So some examples are things, and I'm sure you guys have been with teams, you've probably done this. This is not, like the rocket science, but it seems to be teaming 101 is put in place a short list. I'll read off a bunch, but if you were working with your teams, I'd pick 3, come up with 3 or 4. Assume positive intent seems to be a very popular one. We'll talk about blaming, remind me, because this is there's these toxins that creep in. Silence, how do you treat silence? Some teams will treat like you're gonna make a decision. Silence means agreement. I actually don't like that one. I like people to put thumbs up. Like if we're gonna have consensus, thumb up. I want everybody to participate. You could have a team norm around bottom lining it, meaning, nobody gets to go off on their 5-minute tangent. When you have something to say, give me the bottom line and be clear about it. Minimize distractions, multitasking. I'm terrible on this one. I'll tell people I'll do it, but I'm still looking at my phone and checking my email over here. So have some kind of ground rules around that. Are you gonna start on time? Actually, I work with a client, they're stunning. They always start on time. And it's maybe a better example than the elevator norms. When I pointed it out to them, they were completely unaware that there was anything unusual. People never start on time when I work with them. If you're not on time, if you're a minute late, people get upset. That is a team norm. It was really interesting. They're completely unaware that that was a team norm of theirs. No multitasking. A rule can be, is everybody on or off the video? Things like that. So the one I didn't mention is the conflict one. So let me stop there when we talk about that, because do you have any questions, examples, or thoughts about teaming when people are not getting along? How do you deal with, what are some of the issues you deal with when things don't go right? Either examples you have about how we resolved it or questions you have about that. So let's kind of bring up that element, because that tends to derail a lot of teams. It's like everything's going great except for that person over there. Any thoughts about that? Yeah.
Well, if it's one person and everybody is one way and one person's the other way, that's an obvious you're fired.
Maybe. It's usually never that simple, Jeff.
Well,
Within the confines of a specific meeting, I find that being really explicit about that specific meeting's objective and or the agenda, and
Yeah.
having people stick to that pretty closely can help diffuse any tension
Right.
that might come up from personal interests
Yeah.
being advocated for.
Yeah. Okay. That will manage it within. It's actually, in my business, we call that kind of creating a container, the container being the meeting and the objective, and we're going to work on that. But then there's still things that go on outside of that. Conversations people may have, texts back and forth, even opinions you have about other people that start to erode things. You know what I'm talking about, right?
Mhm.
So one of the things that have, this is kind of comes under the category of what's going to derail teams, and then we have to talk about, so how do you deal with this one virtually? One of the best approaches to why teams, and actually this is true of organizations, but particularly teams, don't work well, comes from a guy whose name is John Gottman. He's a marriage and family therapist, which is interesting, right? So he's very famous for his studies of married couples. My husband coaches couples. He uses this with them, and it seems to be equally relevant to teams. Gottman said that when he worked with a couple, he could tell within 5 minutes whether they were going to stay together or not. You know this, Shelley, right? Yeah. So, and he said it depended on the presence of what he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which I kind of like, right? So they are blame, defensiveness, contempt, and stonewalling. So if you look at each, and these, you sound familiar? I mean, we are human beings. We all have an expertise in one or more of these, right? So one of the things that happens is finger pointing. Almost every team, and in particular, if you look at the stress, I think this really gets to be relevant with what we're dealing with right now. And in the technology environment, people can sometimes be really cool about breakdowns in an office, but there's something about technology. It's like, oh my God, it's not working, or the sound isn't right, or, makes people really anxious. So people are operating kind of at a high level of anxiety. So what we do is our adult part of ourselves that has the ability to take responsibility is not really operating really well. So we finger point and blame. What happens then is people get defensive, and when you're defensive, you're just pointing and blaming back at the other guy. Contempt is a very interesting one. Gottman said that when he saw contempt, he would actually stop whatever he was doing with the couple. Contempt is such a deep sense of disregard for the other person that you can almost feel it physically. It actually hurts you physically. Do you know what I mean? When you're feeling like so contemptuous, like you feel it in your body. And then stonewalling is, where did Martha go? Haven't heard from her. We sent out whatever, she's gone. Well, sometimes it's for my own health, but stonewalling is more, no, I just like, sign, I'm done with you. I'm going to do my own thing. Heck with them. You know, I'm over it. It's a kind of another form of contempt. So these are the 4 things that you want to watch out for. And again, when you're in an office, you can see the contemptuous body language is very obvious. It's the eye rolling. It's the, you know, it's the, all that other stuff. But you know what I mean when you can see you feel contempt, right? You can feel it radiating across these you know, vibes when you feel it too. So let me just stop there. Does that sound at all familiar? Do you run into this? Let me check and see. I don't want it just to be theoretical. Do any of you end up dealing with this or see this in your teams? Got any good remedies? I have a few suggestions, but again, what do you do? I mean, how do you deal with it?
I thought what you said about the silence was especially interesting because I find in the time of Zoom, it's very easy to have that silence and then disregard it and move on from it.
Right.
So I would be interested to hear more about what you think should be done about that silence and ways to solve that problem.
Do you find, yes, and it's easy to hide out. People will turn their cameras off and you don't know why, right? So one of the things, Emily, is to go back to the ground rules and actually have a conversation. How do we operate? And if you can be honest about it, it's not bad. There's nothing wrong here. It's just patterns we've fallen into. And usually it's like, well, maybe Carolyn talks a lot, but Jeffrey doesn't, right? And that's just the way it is. So when you go back to the team, you can say, listen, you know, we got some extroverts, introverts here. It's not like everybody has to come on like, yeah, like this. But can we have an agreement that when it's a really important decision that everybody's going to chime in? Something along those lines.
Well, can I ask a question, Martha?
Sure. Yeah.
Are you assuming that in every meeting there is a leader who is taking on, is particularly now in the Zoom meetings where that a leader is taking on a role of either encourager or police or something to the extra burden to monitor who's not talking, who keeps getting stepped on, who.
Right.
I mean, because you haven't really talked about sort of the leader's role in all of this.
Yeah. Well, and I guess I have a question for you about that. Self-organizing teams are kind of their own category. I guess I'm thinking about this because I do a lot of work with managers and leaders where we actually help them think about your role. And yes, if that is your role, you have an extra responsibility. But I guess I also look at it is everybody on the team has a responsibility too. Now, if someone's going to have to take either an informal leadership role, right, and kind of put the elephant so, but it doesn't have to be a leader. You know, I recognize that may take, I don't know, depending on the circumstances, that can take a certain amount of courage there, but somebody has to at least initiate it to start some kind and take, but that it can be a shared leadership. And I would encourage that if you can share the leadership as much as possible. If not, if you're seeing it happen from anywhere in the team, I would say that's where you lead from where you are, lead from your place. But I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Shelley? I don't know if that addresses it or not, or what are your thoughts?
I'm actually, I'm involved in an organization where we are actually doing a workshop next week on really the EQ of a Zoom meeting. And,
yes,
it really is, we have in this organization, because most of the teams do have leaders who have roles that are different from the other people on the team, that it really is part of in this particular organization, and it's not all of the Zooms I'm on, but with this particular organization, there is an assumption that there's a leader's role, and a lot of what we're talking about here really does fall to the leader, just to keep the meeting going effectively, I suppose.
Yeah, it does. And I hesitate to say, because if it all depends on that one person and they're not fulfilling their role, then you're really stuck unless there's some other routes that the team can take. And that's where I think that the one ground rule that I just think, well, is so important is that if I'm having an issue with a team member, I will go talk to that person directly, because a lot of those things, and also team patterns of behavior, this is where blame comes in. It's like, well, you know, Joey's not, he stinks as a leader. And so what are we going to do? And there's kind of this abdication of responsibility that is as insidious as poor leadership. The thing that is most important, if you can get the team to recognize it, is everybody owns the pattern. Joey may stink as a leader, but what am I doing? And how am I contributing to it? Is I'm talking about Joey behind his back, right? Or I'm sitting there silently. So that's the kind of level of self-awareness. The question you raised, Shelley, is if you're a leader, it puts you in a position of being able to instigate that. If you have to lead from place, it is a more difficult scenario.
I should add that I'm basically retired, so all of the Zooms that are, you know, eating up my day are for
Right.
various volunteer things. And
Yep.
I think in particularly in this organization that I'm thinking about this with leaders is there's always such a cat herding aspect to volunteer team
Right.
stuff.
Right.
So, you know, maybe in a work situation, I'm trying to think back, and, you know, and I think that it's probably easier in a business situation, or even in my experience, there were business situations to that assumption of shared responsibility that makes more sense, I think.
Right. Well, I like what you're doing, which is you're obviously intervening with the EQ. So there's some education. The thing is, if you think about it as a learning event, it's not a bad thing. Like, hey, this is a new world. Let's learn something new. Let's learn about EQ. And that really makes sense, because a lot of what we're finding, what makes the team work well is to be able to build trust and connection. And you have to understanding the fundamentals of kind of the whole emotional intelligence, which is really around being able to be self-reflective personally, but also socially, so that I can understand the social cues of other and kind of have regard for that. Those things are really important and really critical. Again, there's no reason why you can't say, can we talk a little bit about what our kind of rules, you can use whatever language works for you, what rules are going to work for me. At the end of the day, here's that thing I would recommend also.
Could I add
Yeah,
something
yeah.
as well?
Yep.
This conversation is making me feel very grateful, because I hadn't really, I'm coming to realize that my team is functioning very well together.
Yay.
I'm not immediately thinking of instances of conflict.
Mhm.
And I think one of the reasons why is that my manager has set a very strong culture before we transition to the Zoom setting.
Mhm.
Is very aware, like in a meeting setting, for example, will specifically call on people to ask for their feedback, which is I think helpful. I'm always the person that talks too much in a meeting, so I'm trying to focus on listening more.
People are grateful that you're talking, Tara.
So it's I think that the other thing that I've noticed within our team, we don't necessarily have a sort of agreed upon sort of framework, but I really liked what you were saying about the sense of belonging. And my team has been doing a once a week 30-minute meeting where we don't talk about work and we just talk about our lives and what's going on.
Thank you. I was just about to bring that up. So, say more about that, Tara. That's really
So originally we did it every day.
Yeah.
Way too much. I actually liked it because I don't have a family. I live with roommates, so it was in the morning. It was a way to get me up and going, and sort of get me starting my day. But now it's Mondays and Fridays, so it's actually twice a week.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been really helpful to just try to process all of these things. And I think having that conversation gives more understanding to the challenges that people are dealing with that I might not be dealing with. You know, like one of my coworkers has an 8-month-old who's like usually on the call, and you know, somebody has a 5th grader who is always coming in and out of the room. And I think it's helpful to understand where people are coming at from that work-life balance when you
Yes,
see it
yes.
live and you understand what's going on. And I'm based in Chicago, and we've been experiencing a lot of violence. And
Yes.
having a manager who's been really understanding and over communicative, her manager as well, of here's the expectation, here's the reopening plan for our organization.
Yep.
But we also want you to know that this is not necessarily what our team is going to do. Our larger team has given managers the ability to sort of determine that own path for their team based on how they're working remotely and their need to be within the office. So I think that over communication has been really, really helpful as well, of feeling like we're a part of the conversation, being asked our opinion on different ways in which we're doing things, and then getting to see the personal lives of people as well.
Right. So you're covering so many of the bases here, Tara. It's fabulous. And yes, you are fortunate. One of them is the way in which your manager is that over communicating thing is really important. Knowing, and back to a question you asked earlier, Emily, about kind of that participation. One of the rules of thumb virtually is don't go talking for more than 5 minutes without asking for some kind of participation, because people zone out. Don't overuse PowerPoint slides. It's just, frankly, it was always boring. It's even more boring now. But I want to go back to what you talked about. We call it a virtual clearing. So if you do nothing else, what Tara's talking about, and maybe you're all doing this already, either in your we do it with our family. We have a Saturday, we set it up with our kids. We have a family meeting every Saturday. My son in Amsterdam said, let's do a family stand-up meeting once a week. I'm actually missing it right now because this is the once a week. So it's like, you guys know stand-up meetings, right? I mean, this is like so millennial. It makes me feel really
Agile.
We're doing stand-up meetings. So a few things about that. Exactly what you said, Tara, is I heard someone say they referred to it as an adult swim. It's like, it's a once a week or whatever. And I love the metaphor. It's like when you take your kids swimming, and then there's a time when you pull all the kids out of the pool and the adults know how to swim. You don't have to tell them how to swim. Isn't that a great metaphor? So basically this is an adult swim. You talk about whatever you want to talk about. It's one way to look at it. Another one, if you want to have a little bit more structure, is to set it up with a few ground rules. Like we're not going to try to solve anybody's problems. I forgot to mention that before, because your energy goes in. It's not about solving anybody's problems, right, Terry? You're just trying to actually let everybody speak. You may want to start with some kind of a open-ended question. For example, tomorrow I'm working with a leadership team, and this has been a tough week. So I'm going to ask them a couple open-ended questions. It's like we institute check-ins every time, and it's like, so what are you most optimistic about in the world? And what are you most worried about in the world? You can say things like, what are you most concerned about? What's most challenging for you? What's something that you've learned that's been really exciting in the past month? But something that triggers people. And so there's a bunch of ways you can do this. You can we can do, like Tara said, do a weekly 30 minutes. You can start every meeting with an expectation that the first 10 minutes is, we're going to do a check-in. That's what we call it. It's like do a check-in, and before we get to the work, you can even just ask the question, how are you? Seems to be rather powerful, and people will respond to that, and then go to the work. And at the end, it's also useful to often do a check-out. The check-out can summarize, because you have to, in the virtual world, there can be a lot of misunderstandings, miscommunications. So restating things, here's what we decided. But sometimes in a checkout, it's also useful to say, so how did this go for you? How are you feeling right now? Some human quality at the end of it as well.
We
Martha?
also did at the beginning, like just to get us sort of started and figure out what it was like, because it was sort of awkward in the beginning to figure out how we want to do this. We all sat really close to each other and we would talk to each other a lot. But one of the things we did is almost like a show and tell. So everyone brought their favorite coffee mug, which everyone has a favorite for no reason.
Great examples.
Or everyone brought a specific hat. Or one time it was, I don't know, people were showing off their pets.
Yes.
kids and their roommates. So it was a lighter way to make sure that everyone got a turn, but sort of set that in motion in the beginning to sort of kick it off when we started doing it.
Wonderful. It's great.
I wanted to add something else about checking out, and this comes from back in the old days when, you know, I had real meetings, business meetings with real people in the room.
Right.
And this was with a client where advocacy was so ingrained in the culture that everybody would have a meeting and they'd talk about how aligned they were. I'm aligned. And before the meeting was, you know, and within 5 minutes, you know, the emails would be flying around and somebody trying to advocate to the person in power, but well, let's really do this instead.
Right.
And I started doing something called a clarity check, and I've really been doing it at the end of meetings now. And that is really making sure everybody verbalizes what they think the agreements were and what the next steps are.
Yes.
I think that that's just such a slippery power thing when people sort of, oh, I didn't really think that's what we decided.
Right. You know, there is, again, when you're in the office, there's certain structures that you're used to. And when everybody got thrown at home, they had to kind of make up their own. So you actually have to put in place some structures. That's a really good one, which is during the meeting, you might actually want someone to be responsible for taking notes. But to going back and summarizing it is really rather critical. It's really important. So those are all really fabulous suggestions.
Martha, I have a problem that I want you to solve for me.
We shall see.
So I'm on this call for a very specific reason.
Okay.
And I need a few seconds to paint the picture. And so I'm a volunteer for the Red Cross and a leader in our area. And I've been asked to, with a couple of other people, create a COAD, which is Community Organizations Who Assist in Disaster. It's a tri-county, Saratoga, Warren, and Washington County. And it's a best practice in emergency and disaster response where we create a coalition of organizations who have something to do with disaster. So it might be Red Cross, United Way, Salvation Army, hospitals. And we had our first meeting, our get-together meeting in January. And I'm kind of the de facto leader of this group. And then COVID came. So all of our meetings are now this. It's impossible to get people engaged because a lot of these organizations are, in fact, responding to the disaster. There are, everybody has phone calls with the emergency manager of the county. And so getting people engaged in this process is very difficult. I mean, we're trying to build an airplane while we're flying it, and I'm struggling with getting engagement, getting buy-in, and we don't even have any bylaws yet. I mean, we're a nascent group. And so I'm stuck as to what I should be doing to get engagement, to get buy-in, to create our bylaws, to create our mission statement. And I can go on and on and on with my, one of the co-people on my steering committee who's undermining everything we do, but we'll leave that alone.
Yeah. So the central question is how you get people engaged.
Yeah. In this remote manner, there's nobody, we don't have the opportunity to, hey, how's it going? The 10 minutes before the meeting, where, how are you? What's going on? And I don't want to waste people's time while we're on the meeting. I wanted to
that might be the answer right there. That might be an answer for you, Bob, is the belief that it's wasting people's time might be what's getting in the way of getting them engaged. Because people, this is Red Cross, they're there for a purpose, right? This is talk about purpose-driven organization. That engagement doesn't come from the doingness itself, it comes from that sense of purpose. So, being able to, there might be that 10 minutes ahead of time. There's a couple things that you might want to address. Remember, you're kind of all on that part of it is how do we get the work problem solving, but you have to attend to that side of it, which is why are we here? Are they all volunteers that you're engaging as well? Or are they?
No, a lot of them are executive directors of their various organizations.
Right. And when you try to get them together, how many, is it like cast of thousands or?
Well, our initial in-person meeting was, 55 people. Now we're down to like 18 who are showing up for the Zoom meetings.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm gonna let's I got a few ideas, but let's go to our panel of experts here because I bet they've got some thoughts too. What would be some of your ideas about how Bob can engage?
Well, it's just the situation where the stay at home has been the priority for everybody, and the Zoom fills in until we can not stay at home. I have the same problem. I'm involved in all these community organizations, VFW, the American Legion, the American Red Cross. I'm in a medical emergency management team, and our priority is to stay home right now, and I still feel that way. And the Zoom fills in for that. I'm sure it's not going to last forever.
But what makes you feel engaged, Jeffrey? What works for you?
Well, I feel just like Bob. We're not as engaged. We're Zooming now. The VFW meeting, the American Legion meeting, we're Zooming everything. Helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It helps because of our situation. Plus the riots and all that. I don't want to walk in the middle of the riots.
Yeah.
I don't have anything to do with the riots. I believe in peaceful demonstrations.
Yeah.
I don't want anything to do with the riots. I want to stay home with my wife and my dog in Grange, Georgia. There's a fellow Atlantan on here. I forget who is the Atlantan on the Zoom call. The woman from Atlanta.
Actually,
I'm from Atlanta.
Yeah, there you
go.
go.
There you
Well,
go.
you know where LaGrange is. You know where LaGrange.
Yes, yeah, I've been to LaGrange several times.
Yeah, I'm a Granger, 20-year Granger from
Good.
Hamilton, and
So,
we
it's
actually.
so it's a dilemma for you. What any other thoughts, Bob? I got a couple others, but I'm just curious.
It might be worth trying just different types of channels. I know we found that whether it's the cadence of the amounts of meetings or the length of them, or whether it's a webinar, so it's one person talking and you have a chat feature versus this type of Zoom, and maybe it's a different type of the structure to the meetings. I don't know if that would help in a different way to engage people differently.
Yeah.
We've tried to do to have a speaker talk about specific things like the disaster cycle to give some context to what we're doing. But a lot of the people are actually out doing stuff.
Yeah.
And I've actually considered saying, okay, let's just put this on hold. You know, we went from weekly to bi-weekly, and I said, well, why don't we just put this on hold? This is not the time to try to create an organization.
Well, that raises the question for me is what's in it for me for all of these different people for even being in the meeting? That's what I would go to.
Which might be, if I can build on that, actually the place to begin, Shelley, because my suggestion, Bob, because it sounds like you don't have anything to lose here, is to back up and set, because you have to do a little care and feeding of the people first before they can get to work. So I think there's some kind of backup and say, hey, listen, it kind of to take a page from Tara. It's like, let's not, right today, we're not going to talk so much about the work itself. There's urgent work out here, but we got to put our oxygen masks on first. And let's check in as a community how we're doing. So I would like to go around and hear from everybody. And you can have a whole meeting and do it, or you can have, I want to hear a word or a phrase from everybody of what this last month has been like, and actually start to go off of and listen to them. See, part of what the same three, I teach people the same three things every day, which is how do you connect with people? You do three things. One of them is to listen deeply without curiosity, to really focus on what they're saying, not my opinion, not my reaction to it. The second thing is reflecting back. Wow, that sounds really frustrating. Or I was completely unaware that blah, blah, blah. To actually say back what it is that you heard. And the third one is to ask them questions that make them think. What's that like for you? And then just listen. It creates great connection, Bob. So I don't know if that's a solution or not, but my inclination is that you need to connect with those people.
But are you suggesting that from a personal standpoint or from from their organization standpoint? Because how is your organization doing is different than how.
Oh no, personally. Sorry. Personally, yeah, no, you, Bob, as a person. Yeah. Take a moment with Bob on how it's going for you right now. Now, then you have to decide where you go from there. But right now, you don't know. People are disengaged. You don't know why. You have that conversation, you're going to know why they're engaged. They got a million things going on. There's a lot of pain.
Exactly. And I think to that point, like you said, they have a million things going on. Time is the scarcest resource for all these individuals, right? And so to Trisha's point around channels, it sounds like you have like very discrete tasks and almost deliverables you're seeking to get out of this group. And so having a super traditional collaborative approach, which would obviously be ideal to have team meetings, to solicit input, to gain consensus around a first draft of something, just may not be feasible given folks' time constraints right now. So it may fall on you as the leader, or a handful of people that you are able to communicate with as a subset of the broader team to take a first pass at the draft of the mission statement, of the bylaws, and then solicit kind of offline, asynchronously over email, as opposed to trying to do it live and facilitate a group session to get that feedback, whether it's through, a Google Doc where you can live edit the same document, or just traditional track changes, even in Word, so that people's comments and viewpoints can be incorporated, but they're reacting to something and helping you further those deliverables you're seeking to get out of this group.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at, I'm just checking with time on Emily. Do we have to wrap it up, or?
Yes, I'm sorry. I was going to do a time check. It's 1:01 p.m.
Can we hear one more person? And
Absolutely. Yes.
Good. All right. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to recommend digging into Zoom and learning how to use the breakout room function. It can be
Very
really,
nice.
really helpful.
It's a
to
great idea. It's a
take
great
a
idea.
larger group and put them into smaller groups to accomplish specific tasks,
Right.
and then bring everyone back together, or even to just have that personal catch up take a little bit less time, do it into groups of 4 maybe, and then everyone can share within that group, and it won't take as much time as sharing with a larger group of people.
And I would just tie to that again, continue to instill in it some human connection. So they're going to go into the breakout room, tell each other something personal, have them share something with each other so they don't just go right into it. Have them make a connection. So Bob, I don't think we solved the whole thing, but hopefully it was pretty there.
Appreciate it, Bob. I remember that too.
Good. Emily, should I wrap it up?
Yes, and I keep
Okay.
I personally took 3 pages of notes, so this was
Good. This is, there's, I think, and again, Bob, thank you for bringing that up and for your answers. It just kind of underscores teams are so fascinating and complex. When they work really well. We are individually complex, organisms, teams even more so. So I really appreciate your engagement, taking the hour here. It went fast for me. It was great. Seeing some old friends and making some new ones. It's great.
Long-time friends, not old friends.
Thank you, Bob. I got it.